Good afternoon. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. And with us today we have Merrick Alpert for a third visit. Merrick recently completed a 117-mile walk across the entire length of US 1 through the state of Connecticut, from Pawcatuck, Rhode Island, all the way to Port Chester, New York. So he transited the entire state with some people that went along with him and walked with him periodically. Did you have any that walked with you the entire way?
I didn't. We had an intern from the University of Connecticut, David. She was tough. She went, I think, every day but one of the 4.5 days, and that impressed me because it was a long walk.
That's a pretty severe walk. Now, you mentioned that your trip back was about, what, 45 minutes by car?
Well, it took about, I think, 90 minutes, although to me it seemed shorter because I had a hot chocolate in one hand from Dunkin' Donuts and I had a bag of Dunkin' Munchkins in the other while they lasted. And it's stunning. When you walk 117 miles across the state at 3 miles an hour, you see a lot of things. And when you are sitting in a car, you don't see that much. So it was really striking how fast you could travel in the vehicle versus on foot.
Tell us about that walk. What was the point of you doing the walk?
Yeah, absolutely. To start with, what I did, David, was I'm a huge fan of Martin Luther King Jr. and as my opposition to our activity in Afghanistan has grown, I was looking for a way to very clearly state on the record that I don't believe this is the right course from a national security perspective, but I also don't believe it's the right course from an economic perspective. And having served as a U.S. peacekeeper in Bosnia, a Muslim nation, on the ground for 6 months, it was really important for me to make very clear, as always, that I vehemently support our troops. I absolutely, totally, completely, unconditionally support our troops. But I don't think this is in our best interest. And so I came up with this idea, like MLK, you walk, go out there and walk. And I also thought it was really important that I show my patriotism and my support of troops. And so I came up with the idea of carrying a flag. And so for the whole 117 miles, 4.5 days, I carried a big U.S. flag on a staff over my shoulder and walked. And people walking with me had T-shirts that said "End Afghan War." And so the message was pretty clear.
And I have one of them, as a matter of fact, because I did participate in about 3 miles of that walk on the Saturday morning in the midst of it. I brought it back to my studio and gave it to my dear friend Mike Toto, because Mike is more online with you in terms of the Afghan question than I am personally. But so I thought it was more fitting that he have it. So I brought it back to him, and there were any of a number of wonderful people who I stand with in a vigil in Danbury on South Street every Saturday. Well, for me, regularly on Saturday morning. Not every, I have business appointments, but whenever I can, I stand with my friends, and my generic thought is ending war in general, but and not necessarily specifically the Afghan war, but as I said, I brought that back to my good friend Mike Tota, because he certainly deserved it more than I did. But thank you for giving it to me. What kind of response did you get along the way?
Yeah, well, the response was fantastic. It really was. When I started out on a Tuesday morning at sunrise on the Rhode Island side, on the westerly side of the Pawcatuck River, and I started with a couple of folks walking with me, and when I first started, you're starting at sunrise. As I first started, you're not sure exactly what to expect for a response.
Sure.
And pretty quickly, once you're into Pawcatuck, into Connecticut, and you start walking into Stonington, within minutes, what was amazing is the first car pulls up, it was a pickup truck. And I think a lot of people stereotypically would think, oh gosh, this is going to be a person that's not appreciative of this. And exactly the opposite. It was wild that the person rolled the window down and yelled out, "I'm with you. You got my support." And I think a lot of these folks are like me, a pickup truck driver who's in the American Legion and in the VFW, And I said to somebody, these are the folks who do the living and dying in this world. And I think they recognize that we're not on the right course. They want to see the dollars invested in America. And what was amazing is that day after day you would see that happening. There were very few people who would express opposition in some negative term. There were a couple, to be very honest, there were a couple, but it was rare. And there were some highlights along the way. One of the highlights came, I actually think it came later on the day when you were walking. It came when there was a fellow pulls over in a van and introduces himself as an Army recruiter.
Oh.
And it was pretty wild.
Interesting.
And he said, Merrick, I watched this on the news, and I want you to know I support what you're doing. He said, I believe, like you, in a very strong defense. He said, but my view is we don't know what our mission is, and we shouldn't be there.
An Army recruiter,
yeah,
because those are the folks that have gotten a lot of very negative publicity for, in a lot of cases, basically lying kids into the military.
Yeah. And
there's a lot of narrative about that. Maybe true to some degree. How much truth we don't know, but a lot of narrative about some Army recruiters being told from above, say whatever you have to say to get kids to up.
Yeah. Yeah. So it really broke down, it took 4.5 days. It broke down into very distinctive phases. The first day, I went from the Rhode Island border to, walked along Route 1, headed west, and finished up that day right on the Waterford East Lyme border, and saw some amazing things. First of all, we live in a beautiful state. And that really strikes you from the beginning, because a lot of that early walk, and that's the portion of the state I live in, a lot of that early walk is right along the water. And it's really striking when you walk through the marsh areas, because it's quiet. A lot of times, especially in the sort of off-peak hours, you hear your own footsteps, you hear the flag fluttering in the wind, you hear the footsteps of the person next to you, you hear the birds, and it's very quiet. It's normally not the way that you see places, because normally you're in a vehicle. Yeah. And pretty quickly, while I started walking to express my opposition to Afghanistan, because I think there's a better way to engage it, pretty quickly what happened, David, is that the economic impact of the war and of what I think are very misguided policies in general as far as Washington's spending priorities, it became clear that this was a domestic walk as much as a foreign policy walk. I passed by a lot of small businesses.
So unintended benefits, in fact, rather than unintended consequences.
That's right. That's right. And walking at 3 miles an hour, you see a lot of things. When you walk so slowly that you can see the staples in a telephone pole where somebody had put up a poster at some point, you go by small businesses that are boarded up. They're no longer in business. And a lot of those were fresh boards. They hadn't even weathered a season. And that's really impactful, because think about the hopes and dreams and plans of the folks who put that business together, everything they put in it, their life savings, only to have the thing go under in this economy. Yeah. And as you would walk day after day, you would see schools in need of repair, the roads and bridges. David, I wouldn't dare somebody to walk on a lot of the roadway that I walked on. It was crumbling, literally. And what I said at some point during the walk to NPR, when they joined me on the walk, I said to them in an interview, look, I'm much more interested in rebuilding Connecticut than Kabul. It's all well and good to want to go out there and engage the world, but right now our people are suffering, and there is a better way to do this. And for 117 miles, that lesson was really reinforced.
That's interesting. So now, am I presuming that a lot of that boarded up area that you saw was traveling through cities like Bridgeport, for instance, or maybe even New Haven?
Well, it's a great question. Some of it was. Some of the hardest hit areas I saw were in East Haven, New Haven, West Haven. Those areas were hard hit. But what was so striking is that many areas that you would equate with wealth, that you would not equate with poverty or companies going out of business or folks being unemployed, many of those areas, many small businesses there were closed up as well. And when you walk, for example, down the main street where I'm from in Mystic, it's a terrific community, and yet there were clearly places that had gone out of business. And again, as somebody that successfully put together a small business when I got back from being overseas in the military, I know how hard people work to do that. I know how hard small business owners fight. I know about putting everything you have in your whole life into it. And to me, the tragedy is that we don't seem to hesitate to spend billions of dollars overseas, and yet the notion of putting together a real stimulus plan, a real effective plan to help, for example, get the credit markets opened up to small business in Connecticut, we haven't done that. And to me, those are very misguided principles.
That's been one of the secondary things. I know now that we have $200 billion have come back in from the original stimulus package. They've been paid back by the banks. I believe $200 billion out of 314, something like that. The Republican members of Congress want to take that money to buy down the deficit. President Obama is talking about using that money to filter that money down to small businesses, which was maybe where the money should have gone in the first place in a lot of our minds' eyes. A lot of people across the spectrum of political, right, left, center, thought that, you should not have companies or businesses that are too big to fail to begin with. And our capitalist instincts tell us that if a company is going to fail, let it fail. But don't let small businesses that create almost all the jobs in America, don't let them fail.
That's right. And I'm much more interested in focusing on Main Street than Wall Street. To be perfectly blunt, I think it was a catastrophic mistake to go and repeal the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. I think that's how obviously this whole thing commenced. And it commenced because the people who are sitting on the banking committee, when you look at the dollars that have flowed into the members of the banking committee, I believe the most recent number is $30 million that have flowed in over time to the current members of the committee, Democrats and Republicans. Well, look, they're bought and paid for. Everybody knows that. Nobody gives you $30 million because they like your haircut. They give you $30 million because they want to control you. They want an outcome. And look, at the end of the day, the financial service industry got exactly the outcome they put their money in for. They bought it, they paid for it, it's theirs. And from my perspective, when you look at the AIG bailout, by way of example, we spent billions of dollars on this stuff. Then you go and look and say, well, look, it's one thing if we're helping counterparties, smaller banks or organizations in the U.S. That might be undesirable, but people can understand, okay, I get it. But then you go and look at where that money went, the counterparties to AIG. Many of those were foreign banks. Go and look at the data that will show you that U.S. taxpayer money, about $12 billion went to Société Générale in France, the French bank. Another $12 billion roughly went to Deutsche Bank in Germany. You have to ask yourself why billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money is going to make whole foreign banks who are making high-risk investments. That doesn't make any sense. It'd be one thing if I walked out there and it was a yellow brick road. If I walked out there and everything was paved and beautiful and everybody had a job and companies were thriving and our schools had enough money and the roads and bridges were great, David, then I'd say, you know what, maybe it made sense to do that. But the reality is that isn't the situation. And so when I look at this, I recognize that we've got a government that's bought and paid for, and that explains the priorities of the government, which to me are the wrong priorities.
Now, as the audience I'm sure understands that you are challenging Senator Christopher Dodd in a primary next year. That's your intent, that's where you're at, that's what your goal is to do.
Exactly.
Now, we're going to do two things. We can look back. You mentioned Glass-Steagall, you mentioned some of the things that Senator Dodd's taken a lot of heat over in terms of the economic policies of this country, and companies that have given him a lot of money have, in a lot of people's eyes, a lot of voters of Connecticut are very angry at Chris Dodd for what he's done in the past. Let's spend some time talking about what you would have done differently. And it's easy, it's low-hanging fruit for you because you've got a lot of people that are with you and very angry about that.
And there's a lot of fruit out there.
Yeah. So we'll spend some time looking backwards, but I also want to take some time looking forward into the future, and you can explain in terms of the health care debate, which you've talked about, looking forward how you can do better, or what would you do differently than Chris Dodd on the issue of health care. Let's go backwards first and look at the economics that we've come to be bothered by.
Yeah, I think that for me, my vision of Connecticut is a much different vision than what we have today. And to be blunt, because I don't come from the culture of corruption in Washington. I haven't been there for 40 years. I haven't been in Washington longer than Moses and the Israelites wandered in the desert. My focus is on the people of this state. To be blunt, I'm not worried about answering to Wall Street. I'm not worried about answering to political action committees or special interest groups. What I'm worried about is taking care of the average citizen of this state. And my vision is, first and foremost, that we need a senator who focuses on private sector job creation in Connecticut. We have got to get our people working again. We have to do that for a couple of reasons. One reason is because we need to rebuild the confidence in people. The word, David, that I heard across the walk most often was forgotten. When I would talk with a single mom going through Bridgeport or going through Norwalk, or I would talk with a small business owner in Groton, what I would hear over and over and over is, we're forgotten. And I would say, does a senator ever come visit you? Does anyone come visit you? And they would say, no, they don't. So first and foremost, I believe in private sector job creation as the vehicle to move us forward in this state. I think we've just taken our focus off of that. And what I'm about to say for a Democrat is revolutionary, but I believe as a Democrat that the best social welfare program ever created is a good private sector job. And as a Democrat, I recognize that while I believe in these social welfare programs, someone has to pay for it. And before you can redistribute wealth, someone has to create it. Connecticut is a state of small business. Roughly 73% of our businesses are defined as micro businesses with 9 employees or less. And I saw an awful lot of those closed up all across Connecticut. So in addition to private sector job creation, which of course I've done, most of these folks in Washington, to be blunt, have never had a private sector job, let alone created one. And for me, it's different. I've created the very types of high-wage, high-tech jobs that we're desperately in need of today in this state and in this nation. The second thing that is very clear from my walk and from being out there and interacting with folks every day across Connecticut is that you have to have clean government. If you don't have clean government, the people will continue to be disconnected from the folks in Washington, and that doesn't work. That's where so much of the anger and frustration out there comes from. Clean government for me is very specific. It means first, you have got to dry up the power of money in politics. You have to have federally financed elections, public elections and campaigns. That's the way to do this thing properly. And second, I believe in term limits. I don't think it makes sense for someone to go there for 30 or 40 years in Washington. That helps them, but it doesn't help the average citizen.
In terms of job creation, you're talking about the private sector as being the engine. What role does government play in helping small businesses and in helping job creation by the private sector? Well, what can government do? Working hand in hand with
here's what government should do, and my vision again is different than the folks in power today, because to be blunt, most of those folks have never had a private sector job, let alone created one. And so I could tell you as a small business owner, my vision is different. I envision a scenario where the government is actively involved in helping create private sector jobs. That can happen in several ways. It can happen first and foremost by opening up the credit market to small business. On my walk, as is true every town hall meeting out there, one of the main reasons I hear small business folks tell me they're hurting in Connecticut is because they do not have access to the credit market. We did a bailout for all these massive companies, but there is no bailout for Main Street. And so a small business in Connecticut very often can't grow, can't hire additional folks because they don't have access to credit, basic credit. So in my view, you have got to immediately infuse billions of dollars of credit at a localized level.
Is that somehow different than giving money, giving credit? Is there a differentiation?
Well, sure. I mean, what you're going to do is, it's not a giveaway. What you're going to do is a company is going to come in, and the company is going to be able to say, look, here's our business, and then essentially this is the way, before we allowed Glass-Steagall to be repealed, when we actually had localized banks, right, and we had a local banking system, before we allowed these monoliths to take over and obviously eventually be toppled, the way this thing worked is you as a small business owner would have a relationship, you would have community banking. You'd go into that bank. They would interact with your business. They'd flow the dollars necessary for your business. And look, as a small business owner, I can tell you that no small business can succeed without a decent line of credit. You don't have the capital reserve to be able to withstand seasonality and cyclicality, and you sure don't have the capital reserve to withstand the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Again, I understand that from firsthand experience. I know what it's like to literally, having put every penny you have into the company, have to sign the debt note and, along with your business partner, commit yourself to a $100,000 or $125,000 line of credit that you personally were going to have to pay back to that bank. Most folks can't do that, and so you've got to open up the debt market to small business. We've not focused on that in this country. We're more than a year into this economic crisis. These folks in Washington, because most of these folks have never built a business in their entire lives, they don't understand it. And small business people across the state will tell you that is one of their #1 concerns of how they're going to stay in business.
Okay, we look backward, we look forward on that. Let's talk about health care, which Senator Dodd's been deeply steeped in recently as he's trying to restore the faith of the people in Connecticut in him.
Yeah.
Tell our audience if there are any things that you might do differently in terms of health care.
Well, I would start by not taking millions and millions of dollars from the corporations that are looking for continued giveaways in the legislation. I think one of the problems that I have, and one of the problems certainly that I see all across the state each day, is that when people know somebody's received millions of dollars in contributions from the insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, financial service industry, it's very hard to believe they're out battling on behalf of the working class folks in this state. So first and foremost, I don't take corporate PAC money. Right? That is a huge distinction from Senator Dodd. That is a massive distinction. Again, because my vision for Connecticut and this country does not involve taking money from the very people you're supposed to be regulating and protecting the citizens from. Again, a huge difference between myself and the incumbent. The second thing for me is that there should have been a meaningful discussion about a single-payer option. There should have been a much more meaningful discussion about a robust public option, and that really has not been the case. If you look, David, at the discussion that's taken place, the discussion, particularly from the Senate side, the discussion has really been about the creation of new insurance products. It's been how the existing insurance industry is going to be able to get more customers out there of the 47 million folks who are uninsured right now. That, to me, is the wrong approach. There has not been a serious, mature conversation about outcomes-based medicine, about how we provide for the 47 million folks who don't have insurance, and how we make ourselves globally competitive once again, because every widget we produce, every product and service we try to sell into the international marketplace, as you know, you have to layer the additional costs on for healthcare. When your cost is higher than the folks in Europe and Asia who've successfully tackled these issues on healthcare, you can't successfully compete. I tell my Republican friends, if, unlike me, you're not motivated morally to provide for 47 million Americans and give them healthcare because you think it's a basic right the way I do, fair enough. From a global competitiveness standpoint, we should all come to the same conclusion anyway, because you have to tackle the issue of healthcare cost to be globally competitive. That's not a mature conversation that folks in Congress have been having, and that saddens me. As a Democrat, 16 years ago, I worked on the Clinton healthcare effort. I was out in Oklahoma working for the National Healthcare Campaign, trying to get David Boren, at the time he was a senator. Remember that? Nothing changes, David, because at the end of the day, what's the fight over? It's over moderate Democrats. We need to get these moderate votes. Well, you know what? 16 years ago, I saw this thing fail, and in large part, I think it failed because there were a lot of Democrats who weren't willing to go to the mat for it, and that troubled me. 16 years later, rather than 35 million Americans uninsured, as was the case then, today you have 47 million Americans uninsured. We were becoming globally non-competitive then because of healthcare costs in part. Today, clearly, we're even more non-competitive when it comes to the global marketplace as far as controlling healthcare costs. So from my perspective, Democrats need to go to bat for this. We need to stop being Republican light, and we need to go to bat for the basic issue of healthcare.
Well, my friends on Progressive Soup and I are still asking anyone from the Republican Party to explain to us why Medicare, which is a wonderful program, not-for-profit program,
Yeah.
single payer, all the things they talk about as being
The boogeyman, the socialist boogeyman.
and
Yeah.
yet somehow, well, now, historically, we have to remember that the opposition to Medicare came from that same Republican Party
Yeah,
for
yeah.
the most part. So
That's
this is kind of a rehashed opposition to things like Medicare, to civil rights legislation,
Yep.
things of that nature that all came from folks that are now, whose children are now occupying their seats
Yeah.
in our House and Senate. But I'm still waiting for somebody to explain to me why Medicare is so good, and yet we would not want
Yeah.
a single-payer, not-for-profit, government-run health care program for everyone.
Well, the lines that stick out at some of the town hall meetings that I conduct about health care, David, the lines that stick out to me are, I remember a woman saying to me, the government needs to keep its hands off of my Medicare. And I've had other folks who are veterans saying the government needs to keep its hands off my veterans benefit. And when you share respectfully with folks, well, those are government programs. They'll tell you, yeah, but it's different. At the end of the day, I haven't met one person. Again, I've met thousands and thousands of people, literally, across the state in the last 6 months of campaigning. And I've talked about health care every day. I have met thousands of folks. David, I haven't met one person, haven't met one senior who told me they want to get rid of their Medicare. Haven't met one of them, whether they're Democrats, Independents, or Republicans. So this Republican scare tactic, same nonsense we saw 16 years ago, this nonsense, David, where you're going to frighten people and call it socialism and say, oh, it's going to take away your freedom and your rights, and the next thing you know, there's going to be a hammer and sickle on every building. It's nonsense. Medicare is a great program. It works. And that, to me, is a demonstration of how you can have a functioning system where the government provides basic health care coverage to its citizens.
Well, we'll cross our fingers and make sure that the Congress hopefully gets us a good package, a beginning point.
Well, they've given themselves great health care. It would be nice to see Congress give the rest of us the package they receive.
Now, we've got about a half a minute left. If you'd like to just add a few thoughts, and then we'll sign off.
Sure, David, I'd share with you some of the most impactful scenes out there on the walk. I think one of the most impactful was I was walking, it was very cold, going into New Haven, had the U.S. flag over my shoulder, somebody walking with me who had the shirt that said End Afghan War, and a construction worker up on a building doing some maintenance. He tooted the air horn and he waved his hard hat and pumped his fist and yelled cheer and support. And those are the images from the walk that were pretty powerful, and folks can go onto our website and see them.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. This has been Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. We have Merrick Alpert for a third visit, and we'll have him back, I'm sure. Amongst the campaigners, we'll also have Chris Dodd on. Thank you very much for joining us. Good evening. Oh, he said good afternoon coming in. Oh, well. Hope you didn't catch that.